welcome to all. Those of you who are joining perhaps for the first time, those of you who have been for all or most of the previous session, this is the 9th and the final session of this year's Great Decisions program. And we, of course, regret that we were unable to hold the sessions in person, but it's worked pretty well almost all of the times doing it via Zoom, which has had the advantage of enabling us to record the sessions. So they are available on the First Church website, and you can review any that you particularly were interested you particularly, or that you missed. firstpaloalto.com/great decisions. The topic this evening is the US-driven war on drugs. That's been a near constant of US policy now for several decades. My editorial comment, and our speaker may challenge or correct me or underscore it, is that it's been largely unsuccessful, despite a lot of effort and a lot of money. And I'm delighted that the discussion leader this evening is a Stanford colleague, Professor Robert Cruz. Bob is a professor of history. He's a recipient of the Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching. Among other activities at Stanford, he served as the director of the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program, and as director of the Abbasi program in Islamic Studies. Bob earned his PhD at Princeton, and he teaches a course on the global drug wars, which makes him a superb speaker for this final program. And rather than use any more of his time or your time to ask questions, I'll simply conclude this introduction by saying that we are delighted, Bob, that you could join us this evening, and very much look forward to what you've got to tell us. And remind people, if you have questions, you can enter them into the chat box at any time. So over to you, Bob.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I'm now sharing slides, which I hope are visible. How do they look? Are they big enough? Is it the full screen?
It looks fine.
Okay, great. I hope it's big enough. I hope it's legible. Thank you all for having me. It's a privilege. And thank you for turning your attention to this very important subject, one that is near and dear to my heart. I am not the world's expert on the subject. I'm kind of an amateur enthusiast. I do teach a course, but I found the subject via my research on Afghanistan. And it seemed to me that in understanding Afghanistan's place in the world, one needed to understand the global drug scene. And that sent me into a deep rabbit hole that I'm still exploring, which has taken me to other geographic regions, and it's really kind of haunted me now for many years, because I think, as Tom noted, it is such an important theme, and one that has not received adequate attention. But if I may, to make a very challenging and somewhat grim subject more approachable, I'd like to propose to put you all on the spot and submit you all to an examination, or we can call it just a quiz, if that feels better. So I'd ask you to, if you have handy pen and paper, or if you can just remember your answers. This may be the world's easiest quiz. I administered one last week, I think, and there were some interesting responses. So for the purposes of tonight, I'm going to pretend as if I'm the omniscient figure who is the teacher who is grading you, but of course, feel free to disagree. Some of these questions are a little, in reality, a little bit more ambiguous than I have first made them. And so feel free to disagree. And what we'll do is walk through these questions. I'll ask you to register your answers for yourself, however that's useful. And then we'll go through the answers and see if you and I agree on the logic or reasons that we can cite in defense of what are in the end just true or false answers. So I hope that's all palatable. So, and then I don't know, Tom, since you're running the show, the perfect score is going to be a 6. So we'll give 1 point for each correct answer, or what I regard as a correct answer, provisionally. And I don't know what prizes you have on hand there, Tom, but
we'll think of an entirely appropriate a reward for those who.
Okay, so I'll leave that to your creativity, and then at the end of the evening, it'll be better than bingo. It'll be winning the drug wars somehow. So bear with me, and again, perfect score will be 6. And again, this may be the easiest you ever had. So question number 1, Tom already showed his hands on this one. We are winning the war on drugs. True or false? We're starting easy here, but I'll allow you a moment to record that. True or false? Number 2, as an historian, I tend to look at this through an historical lens and recognize, as we'll see in a moment, that humans have been using drugs forever, as long as we've been human. States have been involved in some capacity, as long as there have been states. But the relationship between what humans do and what states do, of course, is a vast subject and deeply contested and disputed. So let's throw this out. It's possible that drugs are part of human life. Government policies, as we'll see in a moment, have really ranged broadly. Maybe that isn't the place to look for our question. Maybe we should be looking at other kinds of human behavior that we study through, I don't know, psychology, or as we'll see later, neuroscience, right? Maybe looking at state policies is not really the heart of the matter, or maybe it is. Maybe state policies are really, what we should all be thinking about and acting on. So another true or false. That's number 2. Number 3, Tom already signaled this, that the U.S. is clearly, it's part of an international regime of drug control, but since at least the 1950s, the U.S. has been the primary player. The UN is the kind of umbrella organization for much of this activity on an international scale, with various international conventions. But clearly, the U.S. has led the way at every turning point. There was a very crucial moment in the early 20th century when China played a very fundamental role, which I'll speak to later. But the U.S. has really been the pioneer, really the iron hand of drug control across the planet in our lifetimes. So here's a question to reflect on, and this is also played an enormous part in American domestic policy. So one of the challenges that Tom mentioned, that I try to take up in this class, is to look at global frameworks for understanding drug production, distribution, and control, and then really look at the American role, which is, I think, primary in the international arena. But then it also, since this course is taught at Stanford and it's taught in the United States, it's led me to appreciate, I'm not a US historian or US politics expert by any means, it's led me to appreciate really the centrality of the drug war in American life, really in ways that were a revelation to me. Over a period of time that really has dovetailed with my own life, right? From born in 1970, but many people recall from late 1960s, American politicians have never turned away from regulation of drugs and punishment of users and dealers as a winning electoral strategy. And I think it's very important to reflect upon the consequences of this now 50-year pattern. So the judgment here is really, it's a kind of common sense question. It wasn't exactly in the Serrano reading that you may have encountered. There's a mention of it in passing, but it leads you to see just how aware are we of its effects, and do we think that basically what we have are tough but fair drug laws, including those that send people to prison. So I think that's number 3. Number 4, since our audience is mostly here, I often confront the idea, given the great number of Californians in my classes, that when we speak of national politics, that's one thing, right? And we speak of, especially today, of political polarization. We have blue states, we have red states. So maybe, just maybe, to add for the nuance to what we're talking about, we're thinking about global politics, but we're also thinking about variations within the US. You all have lived through now a decade or more of state-led decriminalization and legalization programs, right? With California having a very significant role in this, and indeed the entire West playing a role. Maybe California is different. So I'll let you to reflect on whether that is true or false in terms of our drug war laws here. I think this is up to number 5. I may have skipped one. So here's the question. So Tom mentioned that we have been waging a war on drugs since at least the late 1960s. And the logic has really been a kind of supply-side interdiction, which really animates a half dozen US government entities, which receive and spend billions of dollars every year. So there's a very strong institutional and I would say ideological logic to supply-side interdiction. And here I've paraphrased language from the War on Terror, but that works here too. And the idea is that we must stop the drugs there before they come here. The logic, of course, is that we must, go to the jungles of Colombia. We must spray in Peru. We must interdict in Afghanistan to keep them out of, keep drugs out of our high schools, right? To keep them out of the hands of our children is the logic. And again, no politician, to my knowledge, has ever lost a vote making that argument. So is this in a sense, I've called this a true or false question. Is this a valid claim or an invalid claim? Is this an assumption that you support, or is it one that you think is false in the kind of ethical sense? So I think this is my sixth question here. And this is, I worded it to be succinct to get it on the slide here. It's really a reflection of the search for alternatives to our very punitive supply-side interdiction strategy, coupled with a very draconian American set of policies that have led to mass incarceration, in which, of course, the United States leads the world. So as a shorthand, I've used the term rehabilitation. There are other ways we can add to this. We could talk about simply alternative, non-punitive drug policies. But I think rehabilitation is interesting because it suggests for many libertarians, we can have drugs, we can have legalization, we can loosen things up. And the answer is essentially to, offer people rehab for those who can't handle it, for those who fall into addiction, right? If the role of the state is really to protect our health, which is the modern claim for drug control, to prevent the use of psychoactive drugs for non-medical purposes, really the answer then would be some kind of medical solution, a medical alternative. And so rehabilitation is kind of a catch-all phrase for a world in which there is, permission for drug use, and society, basically picks up the most vulnerable and uses rehabilitation to round it out. So true or false? Is this the most sensible answer? Which some people, that's a kind of a short answer for critics of the American drug program as it stands. Okay, so those are 6 questions. Probably very easy for you. Again, Tom has a prize for you, whoever scores the perfect 6, based on my admittedly, possibly idiosyncratic judgment of what scores are correct. All right, so here we go. So let's see how your answers turned out, and let's see how we answer these questions. And what I'll do is offer, a few arguments for my answer, for what I regard to be the correct answer. And feel free to jump in or save your questions. But I'll go through and try to model a way to think, in my limited learning, how to think about this question. Are we winning the war on drugs? So let's start with that. So the first answer, which I take from the United Nations, is that first of all, is it working? Are people using fewer drugs? The answer there, and this is a report from just this year, or 2021, I guess. Some of these data are a little bit old, but at this first index, we have to say no, because the humans across the planet are using drugs more than ever. And partly they concede it has to do with the age group that uses drugs. But and again, these figures are estimates, and there's wiggle room there. And I usually, the first day of my class, my global drug wars class, I introduce a massive caveat, and that is much of what we'd like to know about drug use, about drug interdiction, about what we call the drug wars is really lost to us civilians because, one, I don't have national security clearance. I'm not privy to internal DEA or FBI or CIA or whatever conversations. I'm not a UN official and so on. I don't work for, Mexico or Colombia. Similarly, none of us that I know of are working within a cartel or any kind of, local street drug gang, or even maybe the neighborhood, dealer. I have no access to any of that knowledge. So in a way, we're kind of putting this puzzle together, knowing that there are massive swaths of information that simply aren't legible to us as lay people. So the UN is one resource for us, which suggests a total increase. And this increase, if you look at it, how it's charted over the last 4 or 5 decades, what we see is a steady increase. So at that level, humans are using more. Draconian state policies are not reducing resort to these psychoactive substances on a planetary scale. What else can we say? Here's a long quote. I'll let you read it. But to summarize, not only are we using more drugs as humans, we're using a greater variety of drugs. And this is a theme that one of our authors that I'll mention in a moment, that I assigned in my course, David Courtwright, emphasizes, through an historical perspective, that in fact, we humans have always used psychoactive substances, but given European colonial expansion and really the knitting together of the world into larger and larger markets in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, humans gained access to more and more psychoactive drugs across the planet. And so he begins with, talking about tea and coffee and tobacco, goes on to sugar, and goes on to cannabis, and then goes on to, to opioids. And we live in an era in which synthetic drugs are the new frontier. And if we chart this globally, of course, the United States remains the greatest consumer, followed by Western Europe. And you can basically graph the prosperity of the country, with its drug use. But if one thinks of the relative growth of middle classes, urban middle classes across the planet, say, for example, East and West Africa, there too you find increases in both the volume and variety of drugs that people are using. So it's quite fascinating. So I think David Courtwright uses a metaphor, something like, the unending frontier of the human obsession with psychoactive drugs. So on this level too, we are not winning any kind of so-called war. This is a snapshot of just what the big commodities are that are highest in demand and most used across the planet. Again, a couple of years ago, but I think this pattern mostly holds. Cannabis is the king, followed by various kinds of opioids, which are being more and more diversified synthetically. And then we move into a whole host of other synthetics, and then cocaine is still quite popular and spreading. And with, on the one hand, increased standards of living in some countries, cocaine use is up, but also because cocaine routes have been diversified, scholars identify a pattern of what they call leakage, so that from port to port, as cocaine moves, there tends to be some seepage of the supply into local communities, so that we have often new access, new areas. So cocaine is deeply entrenched across lots of different routes. And I think that one of the striking features of the drug trade in the last 2 decades is its diversification in sites of production, and then in the kind of avenues of distribution and transportation, which also roughly overlap onto new areas of use. It's quite fascinating. If you can imagine a port warehouse, and the ways in which so many people interact with that port warehouse. By the way, there's a wonderful film I try to draw on other kind of non-scholarly portrayals, and there's a great book by an Italian journalist, Roberto Saviano, who's written a book called 000, which has been dramatized in I've forgotten what service offers it, but you may find it on a few. But it basically follows one shipment of cocaine from some unknown place in Latin America through Mexico into Italy. But it's brilliant because it focuses on this basically one container, I think, but it shows all the different nationalities of people who are involved in this. And then you get a sense of the ways in which, as that container ship moves across the world, it implicates different communities, including American, very established kind of upper class American shipping barons in the mix. So it's of course you have your stereotypical mafia figures and dealers on the street, but you also have people in different corporate industries across the planet actually collaborating and being complicit in this enterprise. So again, the kind of global net is really, really staggering. And for all of us who've been observing globalization in recent decades, this is a classic example of one of the perhaps unanticipated turns there. So how much is the drug trade worth? And this is just, again, we're still working on the question, are we winning? Estimates range broadly. I hope you'll appreciate the photograph here from Breaking Bad. We have Walt and Jesse Pinkman here. The estimates range broadly, but I think even 15 years ago, it may be even 320 billion, and it's probably much more now. It's just very, very difficult to put a figure on it, given secrecy. Much of it does run through banks, but again, very hard to put this all together. If you've been following, for example, sanctions on Russian oligarchs, all the shell companies, all the different kind of holdings and kind of fictive owners, you get just a snapshot what the drug barons have done for many decades with amazing sophistication. So I've offered another index here. Are we winning the drug war? If you look at overdose, definitely not. And this is really the darkest and most tragic index we can offer here, I think. I think we've been hovering since COVID at around 100,000. And there's some debate about how do you count an overdose death? It's not always so obvious. It's not always so clear that every jurisdiction marks it in the same way. But this is a stunning figure, and I think the NIH and others and CDC have talked about how we're losing about 100,000 Americans a year, and that number is expected to stay steady. If you can see some detail in this figure, please note that there's a gender coding to this, and males are overdosing increasingly in a much higher proportion. If you start out in 1999, males are worse, but it's not such a great difference. But look at how great with the yellow line versus the orange line, how men are overdosing at such greater percentages, as we come to the present. I have no argument for that. I have no explanation, except that it perhaps maps onto other features of American life. If one thinks of white male suicides of a certain age group, if one thinks of the Trump phenomenon, if one thinks of deindustrialization, anxiety about middle class status, anxiety about a lot of things that drew people to the Trumpian populism, I think some of that does overlap with resort to drugs. I mean, another factor which we'll come to in a moment is, of course, the OxyContin, Purdue Pharma, the kind of pharmaceutical company initiated addiction process, which also I think follows the timeline somewhat. You think that would affect men and women equally, but I think there's equally men are standing out in this. So another argument against this idea that somehow all this money is being spent for some noble purpose. Another figure that I'd highlight for us is really what's this doing to American society, and I'll try to link the international to the domestic. And here, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this argument that, of course, our prison system catches up Black and brown people much more than white people, and largely this is a function of state legislation and of state prisons. And so you can follow the numbers there, which in this graph start at 1925. Again, if you can't see the detail, the uptick, the really staggering uptick you see begins in the 80s, but goes well through the 90s. And so I think what's striking about the story of mass incarceration is that it's definitely a bipartisan development in American politics. So we think of Nixon and Reagan. For many people, Nixon and Reagan are the kind of demonic architects of the American drug war and of mass incarceration. But in fact, if you look at a book I'll cite in a moment, really the Clinton administration was formative, and it was really pivotal, not only in sending people to prison for drug offenses, but broadening what we mean by incarceration and broadening its effects. But I'll come to that in just a moment. So that was our first big question. So I think hopefully I persuaded you that the war on drugs has been a failure, but now we can perhaps dig deeper into why and how, and then perhaps what the alternatives might be to it. I mean, here's another kind of perspective here, and this is, as an historian, it's interesting to kind of swim in this broad question because humans have engaged in the cultivation of psychoactive drugs everywhere. I mean, it's seemingly universal. I mean, and what David Courtwright will tell us, I'll cite his book in a moment, is that not all psychoactive drugs become globalized. That really depended upon the taste of a few European publics, whose empires created these trading empires that cast these commodities like sugar, tobacco, and tea and coffee and so on, across the planet. Some things are used locally, like khat or betel, it is chewed. Those were not taken up as global commodities. But there are other ways in which governments act, and one way they act, of course, is by declaring certain commodities, licit or illicit, by assigning criminal, penalties to them, and by engaging or not in things like rehabilitation. So let's see what you answered here. And the entree to this is the book I've been citing, David Courtwright's Forces of Habit, which I highly recommend. A very readable survey of 1,000 years or more of humans and drugs. And I'll just highlight one important argument of this to highlight really the importance of state policies, and the international order that has emerged over all collectively across state policies. And here's the basic one basic thesis of forces of habit, and that is that for hundreds of years, the great European empires, the Dutch, the British, the French, and so on, scoured the planet looking for things that would make them wealthy, right? They found cannabis, they found tobacco, they found sugar, they found coffee, they found tea, and so on. They found opium, right? The British found opium, cultivated in India, and then fought 2 wars in the 19th century to hammer open the Chinese market. And what we remember is the opium wars. The Europeans made vast sums of money from trade in these psychoactive substances or commodities. We know that some of the wealthiest families in Britain, that remain some of the wealthiest families in Britain, not only, of course, own slaves and so on. That's been the recent kind of sensation and debate in Britain itself. They also traded in all these commodities, including opium. And there were important debates. Critics at the time in the 19th century noted that that British merchants were addicting millions of Chinese people, and they had an answer for this. They argued that this was simply a choice, or they argued that the Chinese were not fully human, so it didn't really matter. There were long kind of convoluted arguments about why essentially profiting Britain, profiting the empire, justified everything, right? This is a strong colonial argument that we see across Europe in the 19th century. But what's important for our purposes tonight is that these Europeans were focused solely on these commodities as profit. A secondary interest they had in many of these commodities was that they facilitated the work of empire on another level, and that was they often simply inebriated or intoxicated or sedated colonial populations whose labor the empire depended upon. So we have lots of accounts of enslaved people, of indentured servants, of laborers, in the tropics, across the planet, wherever the British flag flew, who often encouraged, in certain occasions, alcohol, smoking, all kinds of intoxicants, including opium, to make these populations more pliable and to make their labor essentially cheaper for extraction. So we often have David Courtwright bring examples about some scenarios in which you have donkeys and humans being given various substances to keep them going through the day, right? And keep them kind of off balance so that they can work, but they're not with it enough to actually rebel. So these twin kind of pillars of colonial rule were really quite striking in that empire was built upon many of these commodities, again with profit and control being the chief primary and secondary motivations. And the curious question that I think many historians are still wrestling with is, what happens in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when across the planet these empires essentially shoot their cash cows. They turn against opium trading. They turn against cannabis trading. And by the early 20th century, there's broad international agreement that states should play a different role. They shouldn't simply tax these commodities for revenue. They shouldn't simply see them as sources of income for empire and power and for labor control. Instead, states have a different role. With the emergence of the welfare state and new conceptions of medicine, and new knowledge about chemistry and so on, and of public health, there's a new conception of what states should do, and states now should come forward and protect the public and increasingly regulate psychoactive substances and draw a firmer line between those that are meant for medical use and those that are meant for non-medical use, which begin to be cast into the realm of things that are not only unhealthy but also amoral. It is interesting, the Chinese story to this too. I'm sure Tom is familiar with this, but the whole story of the Opium Wars looms large in I think the contemporary Chinese nationalist imagination. This idea of encirclement, of European hostility, this idea of Europeans as well as Americans actually who were involved, poisoning the Chinese public, seeking their destruction, at the expense of the health of the Chinese nation. And so actually some of the early international drug control pioneers are Chinese nationalists who criticized Britain, the US, and other powers for, intoxicating the Chinese public, making millions of people in Chinese society, as well as in the Chinese diaspora, opium addicts, right? And because in San Francisco and San Jose and Los Angeles, throughout the planet, where there's a Chinese diaspora, there's Chinese opium use. We see in the early 20th century another key feature of our drug war, which persists to the present, and that is that drug control experts on the medical side, but also kind of in Christian evangelical organizations who are also pushing against alcohol during this period. In different locales or different arguments, but essentially one pattern that begins to solidify in the early 20th century is that certain of drugs are really, the kind of bane of certain ethnic and national communities. So good Americans should resist opium because it is brought to us from China. These Chinese laborers sitting in their drug dens, opium dens in San Francisco are trying to bring their poison to other Americans. And there's almost always a kind of a sexual component here with respect to the kind of sanctity of white women, that they seek to intoxicate white women to take advantage of them in a sexual sense. So we see a very similar argument that emerges around cocaine and African Americans in major East Coast cities in the South. And then in the West, we see arguments that almost mimic the same language about Mexican Americans and Mexicans with respect to marijuana. And the term marijuana, of course, comes on, it comes to us from Mexican laborers, as a loan word for cannabis. And it's something that really, I think, is cemented in the American imagination, that there are certain commodities that are on the outskirts in the kind of moral sense and ethical sense, but also mapped upon communities that are marginal to a kind of so-called American national mainstream identity. So this brilliant book, Forces of Habit, draws us all together. But I think that the real striking point I want of all these points to take away is the idea that for hundreds of years, states had one policy, which was simply tax, proliferate, trade, make money, sky's the limit. We're going to consume more and more, and people did, right? People began to drink tea with sugar. They began to drink tea with sugar with cigarettes, right? So this expanding world of substances goes on and on. And he has this one. He begins this book with this great anecdote about a guy in Chicago who is in a morgue. The doctor does the autopsy and tests for all the substances in his stomach and in his bloodstream, and it's a kind of astounding laundry list of half a dozen drugs, half a dozen intoxicants, plus all this different food that you'd recognize in being all over the planet. And Courtwright uses that as an example of basically look at already this is like 1900, look how globalized our planet had become, and compare what that man had in his bloodstream and stomach in Chicago in 1900 or so versus how most of the world has lived for most of humanity, right? You think of medieval Europeans having a very limited diet. You think of people inhabiting East Africa having a limited number of commodities. And you think how the planet has brought this all together. And for hundreds of years, powerful states encouraged this. More was better. Something happens in the early 20th century that is moralistic, it is medical, it is pharmacological, and it is punitive. And that is now the drug war world that we live in. To leap ahead a moment, I wanted to highlight the Sackler family, because this is another kind of argument that, the arc that I try to draw is, you have mass expansion of drug markets and state encouragement of their proliferation. You think of all the seafaring empires and traders, opium being grown, by the British in India, shipped on to China. They fight 2 wars for this, so on. This is, empires pushing stuff, right? Early 20th century, there's a reversal. And now people are being, so-called experts have emerged, doctors leading the way, but also various kinds of moralists and religious figures. And we move into a kind of restrictivist mode, much motivated by xenophobia, by anti-immigration in the United States, by racism, by a certain understanding of sexuality. All this comes to bear in the first few decades of the 20th century, which then get worked out internationally, so that we have the first drug control conventions, some initially backed by Chinese nationalists, which get taken up and initially, soon have a very American imprint by the end of the Second World War, where the U.S. emerges as this powerful global force. To add a wrinkle to my kind of teleological narrative, I would remind us all, I'm sure many of you have read some of these books, unpacking what the Sackler family and what other major pharmaceuticals have done with the opioid pain treatment, beginning in the 80s, 90s, and really to the present, the Sackler family being the most prominent. And there are a number of good kind of journalistic accounts of them. I thought it might be useful to point out 2 films that I think are quite useful. One is a kind of miniseries melodrama, Dope Sick, which I think is quite brilliant because it much of the action takes place in West Virginia. one of the protagonists is a doctor himself who is kind of seduced by OxyContin and its possibilities among coal miners in his community. I don't want to give too much away, but he becomes an addict himself. It's quite powerful. And then the second parallel kind of narrative is trying to peer into the dynamics of the Sackler family itself, which is quite fascinating. And so, in an academic class, we try to link various phenomena to different moments in world history and global politics, and sometimes a socioeconomic moment or order. And so I've tried to think about this as I don't know what you want to call it, the present. It's definitely some stage of capitalism, I would think, hyper-capitalism or surveillance capitalism, whatever you want to call it. But this is a fascinating moment in which the pharmaceutical industry bought a significant portion of the American medical profession and its regulatory organizations, right? So I feel uncomfortable in 2022, running down the CDC and other institutions that I think have done an important job in keeping us safe during COVID. But I think we also have to acknowledge that on opioids, they were bought, and American policy was sold, and not just Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, but a dozen companies bought these regulatory agencies. And if you've been following the litigation, it's still ongoing, and it's really frustrating to follow because there are appeals, it seems, literally every week. There's a new judge who offers a new judgment or reversal. But now essentially every pharmaceutical entity that made any pill like this has been found culpable. And now every major pharmaceutical institution, I mean, the distribution network of Walgreens and Rite Aid and Walmart and Target and so on, all these have been named in these suits and plaintiffs have received awards against them that are still pending, of course. But it's quite striking that a whole structure of our society, courts have found to be complicit in this. And so I think the best documentary film that kind of takes you through the whole process is from the birth of the pill itself through the birth of the marketing apparatus, all the payola that went into bribing doctors, all the pill mills, all the corrupted legislation is wonderfully told in an HBO documentary series called Crime of the Century. And again, I know there are other books that do this well, but I think those are Dope Sick and Crime of the Century are places I think to start to get a handle on this. And so this is an interesting moment where states are regulating some kinds of use, but actually promoting others. And I think what comes through in both these films is the role of Congress in facilitating the actions of these companies. So it's hard to categorize how to put this, where it goes in my historical typology, but I think this is a moment in which the American state, at least, has been highly selective in, whom it punishes for what kinds of drugs, what kinds of commodities are truly illicit, what kinds of addiction are acceptable, what kind of, what's public health mean, whose public health is being guarded. These are all questions I think that are, that merit our scrutiny in the light of an ongoing, opioid epidemic. And I think this is where we have the 100,000 opioid deaths per year, which of course was exacerbated by the conditions of the pandemic. So this is, again, a long kind of a discursive answer to, doesn't matter what states do. And here I'm trying to argue that if one looks at the arc of some 1,000 years, it's fundamental what states do. States either, encourage this as a kind of, capitalist enterprise, or they restrict it with all kinds of consequences. And today, maybe we're in an era in which they're doing both, actually. But it's clearly critical that in this case alone, whether or not we have actual regulation is fundamental to what we think about when we think about drugs. So here we are, I think, to number 3. Let's look more closely at U.S. drug policies. They're tough but fair, some would say. I mean, that tends to be the consensus of the American public, which re-elects politicians who wrote these laws. Here, my answer would be a very short one, and that would be to reflect upon Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. She started her career at Stanford in law school and is now at Ohio State. You may have seen this book in one of your book clubs or just picked it up. Otherwise, it's become a much assigned, much commented upon book that uses an interesting, to me, historical analogy. She's not a historian, but I think it's a wonderful use of history. But in short, she argues that there are more Black men locked up in America today than were ever enslaved at the height of American slavery. So it's a stunning kind of analogy And of course, there's population change, growth, and all that. But essentially, she walks us through the story of how we came to lock up 2 million people, how U.S. led the way internationally, and how this disproportionately affected Black men. And she acknowledges, this isn't the story of all of Black women or of Latino men and women. This is focused on Black men, but she makes a strong case that this is that they're the primary kind of targets of this. And having taught this for many years, it's been fascinating to see how people respond to the argument. And some people dismiss it as a kind of conspiracy story because there is no single villain. There's no single moment when someone presses the button and all of a sudden 2 million people locked up. But the chief thread is really about the drug war, and it didn't make it into the title. She doesn't lead with that, but that's really, as I read the book, the chief thread is how drug laws have been used to incarcerate 2 million people, which she sees funnily as a project of social control, perpetrated by white elites at a time beginning in the late 60s when whites began to be uncertain about their status vis-a-vis other groups, especially African Americans. And so again, I think she's quite fair in pointing to not just Nixon. In fact, Nixon comes off surprisingly quite good in this book, because he actually, when he launched the so-called war on drugs, he actually saw it in a kind of holistic way as a project of punishment, but also rehabilitation, also funding for all kinds of social programs, actually, which were somewhat anomalous, but were by today's standards actually more progressive than anyone since. I think it'd be fair to say. I think she would argue that. Of course, Ronald Reagan contributes a great deal to this. And then the Clinton administration gets, I think, special treatment because not only do the numbers of people in prison go up dramatically in the 80s, as you saw from that chart, but what Jim Crow means really comes into view, because it doesn't just mean going to prison. Having a drug offense in this area, the first time, really means becoming a felon. And under Clinton, becoming a felon means losing access to public housing. It means often your relatives lose public housing because if you have something on you and you're caught and you live with them, they often lost their public housing too. It meant losing lots of welfare provisions like food stamps. It meant losing access to student loans. So it meant there were new restrictions on employment, and of course on disenfranchisement, done on mostly on a statewide basis. But this is all part of a program of what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. And if one thinks about it, it's staggering to think about how this contributed to recidivism, how it contributed to addiction, how essentially if you got a charge and you were made a felon, there was no escape. There was no way back to housing, to welfare state provisions, to employment, to education. That really devastated whole families. And so there are also some great documentary films. One I forgot to mention here is called The House I Live In, which follows through a few families through this. So I think really we see family separation. We see the parents born out of, kids born out of family situations. All stuff really spike under Clinton. She argues due to these policies. And the other key factor here is that she argues that drug use doesn't change during this period. The crime rate was actually going down, but we locked people up more and more, which is punitive. It was racial, and it was done to earn votes, to make the Democrats look tough on crime, to answer the longstanding critique from the right. So it's a devastating book. I think his arguments are still very much with us, and that is kind of straight line through the drug war. This has yielded more than any other kind of legal idea, mass incarceration in the United States. So the numbers show this, right? I'll just pause on this briefly. The kind of aqua color is the Black population nationally, and then its share of the prison population. And of course, for Latinos, it's also skewed. And for Natives, it's a small figure, but it's double, right? So double the number of Native Americans, are locked up, and the white numbers are much lower. So this is, I think, fairly irrefutable, but it really has not made a substantive dent in American penal policy, even though Obama talked about it, Trump talked about it, and I think through Trump's celebrity connections and the Kardashians, of all people, a few people got their sentences cut, or they got pardons. But it's very striking that you probably heard the example of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. with a racialized association with, I think, crack cocaine having 100-to-1 penal disparity compared to powder cocaine, which is thought to be a white drug. Obama did intervene on that question, but I think he shifted it only to like 5-to-1. So it remained fully, unequal, unjust, and racialized to the disadvantage of African Americans. But essentially, no American president has touched these arguments, and very few people in Congress have really made any headway here. Just another illustration of really, I think that brings together a focus on the drug offenses. This is what our prisons looked like in 1980, and this is what they look like in 2019. Just staggering growth, really on the backs of people caught up in the drug trade. In the broader context, I should say very briefly that Michelle Alexander does nicely show how American cities changed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Deindustrialization was huge. There were Black communities, for example, in Chicago, Atlanta, New York, Washington, so on, that had good middle-class jobs. And those are the best examples of industrial cities, but I'd say Chicago's a good one. Deindustrialization, redlining, different kinds of discriminatory measures, eviscerated the Black middle class in many cities. And so that was also part of the kind of sociological structure, which left urban African Americans really victim to a moment in the 1980s when the drug trade is one of the only viable kind of economic spheres available to them. So it's a very comprehensive, complicated argument. And just another illustration of how crime rates were down. Crime rates are going down, headed in a lower direction after the anxiety of the late 60s, and yet our incarceration imprisonment rate went skyrocketed. So that has not yet been brought back into any kind of realignment. And of course, this graphic tells you the story, that if you're a Black man born in the US in this century, you have a 30% chance of going to prison, which is really quite amazing. And even for all men, 1 in 9 is staggering. But for Black men, for Latino men, of course, it's much higher. And again, this is fundamentally on the backs of how we police and then incarcerate around the drug trade, drug possession, and so on, drug usage. And naturally, we know this is one area in which the United States leads the way on a per capita basis. So California for a moment. California is a blue state. It likes to think it's different. How different is it in this respect? Here, I was actually surprised to learn this. This is a recent image I found. If it were its own country, it'd be the 5th largest economy in the world, right? We know that. It's a global entity, right? But we out jail most of Europe, right? And I think we out jail Brazil and Russia, actually, on a per capita basis. Those aren't on this map, but I actually noted that the other day. And it's also, like the rest of the United States, it's done in a way that singles out Black and brown residents. So just a brief aside into California. So here we're getting to this, maybe the more substance. I'll begin to kind of wrap up. I know you probably have questions, and I've been going on. I'll begin to move toward the end of my presentation, but I have 2 more questions here. And this is on the whole supply side critique. So we got to stop them there so they don't come here. So we hear that for terrorists, and we hear that for drugs. So we have to spend, as Serrano noted in the piece you may have read, we have to spend billions of dollars in Plan Colombia. Since 1970s, we've spent many billions of dollars in Mexico, many millions of dollars in Afghanistan. Really, it goes around the planet. That's the only way to go forward. And the important kind of fact that I'd like to start with here is that the DEA is an entity that has 92 foreign offices in 69 countries. So this invites a lot of, I think, reasonable speculation about really what America's leadership in the global drug war means. What's it actually doing? We've seen that it's not actually curbing use. Use is expanding. Overdoses are increasing. We're using more and a greater variety of substances. So what are we doing, right? My lay interpretation would be that this is a kind of platform of American foreign policy that is meant to project authority around the planet in ways that make sense and are morally palatable to audiences, domestic and international. And it's staggering. If you were teaching this class and you ask your students, are there any foreign police departments, in your town or in your state or in your country? I mean, it's staggering to think that we have DEA, among other agents, in 69 countries across the planet. I mean, that's just staggering. And if you watch any of these great, action series on Netflix or other streaming services that portray and kind of dramatize, glorify the American drug war, the heroes are always the guys wearing the white hats are always the Americans who are going around shooting people in Colombia and Mexico and places. So I'm not sure those series do a great job at problematizing that and what it means. But I think it's crucial that we see the drug war as one of several avenues for the projection of American power. And I would suggest that it's not really about controlling drugs to make us all safe. It's a way to expand American control and power. And drugs are a useful vehicle for that. And I'll say more about the historical context for that. But the map, I think, is worth thinking about. Obviously, it's a global project, right? This is, it's truly, one of the most globalized sets of commodities that one can imagine. So, a global approach makes sense. But let's go back briefly historically to a historian at University of Wisconsin, Alfred McCoy, who did brilliant work beginning in the 60s and 70s in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, when he was going to work on something else, but stumbled upon what he calls U.S. complicity in the drug war. And to be brief here, the argument that McCoy offers, in short, is that drugs have always been a very, liquid, fungible, highly mobile, highly lucrative commodity for states that want to use them to create revenue off the books, right? So you can have a CIA, he argues, and you can have a DEA, and they don't ever need to talk to each other. They coexist. Each has its mission. Each collects billions of dollars, but they're actually working at counter purposes historically. So he argues that, in Southeast Asia, what he observed was that facilitating certain drug transactions were actually were actually to the benefit of the CIA, because they helped certain partners raise money, gain power, gather weapons, and so on, gain advantages against their rivals in ways that avoided scrutiny in Washington, right? So if you can read the subtitle of this book, he identifies a kind of pattern that began in Southeast Asia, but extended to Afghanistan in the 1980s, when, as many of you know, the United States supported the Mujahideen against the Soviet-backed Afghan government and Soviet-occupying Red Army. And in doing so, they backed parties that were deeply involved in the opium trade, the heroin trade out of Pakistan. And the argument here is that the CIA, either looked the other way, was complicit with, or aided these parties, because this was access to yet another revenue stream on behalf of, American victory in the Cold War. So that pattern extends, of course, across the Americas into Central America, 1980s. And so this pattern actually is quite well documented beyond McCoy for Mexico itself, if one wants to think of that as a kind of focal point, where the United States was always engaged with actors that they knew were involved in the Mexican government, who were involved with the offering protection to certain cartels or pre-cartels. And they did so in the name of bolstering the Mexican right against the left. So the Cold War was a moment in which, of course, it was right versus left, but consistently, McCoy and other scholars have argued drugs were a means to support the right, to get arms into the right hands, to get money into the right hands, to fight the left in dirty wars that the U.S. Congress didn't always want to fund. So that claim has been, lingering for many decades. It's quite interesting, and this is a point where I think in my class, my students and I run into frustration, because it's really an area in which we hit the limits of, I'm a historian, we want to see documents, we want to have solid proof. We hit a limit in what we can know, given the nature of secrecy of state archives and so on. But let me look ahead briefly. There's one place where we do get some revelation about this, and that is around the Contras. The National Security Archive at George Washington University is a tremendous resource that devotes itself to filing suits, filing petitions for declassification. So we have some declassifications around, Oliver North. This crowd will remember, around CIA complicity in the movement of drugs actually to the United States, to American streets, so that cash and weapons could land in the hands of our ideological allies against the left in Central America. So this is a theme that's explored in many new documentaries and accounts. But again, the smoking gun is, I think, still largely absent, but the pattern there, I think, is broadly persuasive. A second feature that I highlight for us, again, we're thinking about the question of, do we stop them there, or supply side prohibition? And this is the fundamental that. So I'm not asking you to buy entirely the CIA angle or the U.S. government angle, working across purposes. I think personally, it's at least for the scenarios that I understand, I think it's convincing. But this next point is really, I think, is incontrovertible, and that is McCoy's formula of the stimulus of prohibition. I think Serrano, in the article you may have read, referred to it as the balloon effect. And the contention there, of course, if you study economics, this will make sense to you. That is, if you crack down, say, on Colombia, on one commodity, traffickers are immediately going to, and cultivators are immediately going to pump money into, picking up on the they have a new incentive because prices go up, right? So you squeeze Colombia, prices go up. So people in Myanmar will pick up the slack. The market's still there, that's not changed, but there's less supply. So they have a new incentive to simply shift cultivation to take up a new crop, which in many cases they can do, for many of these commodities, they do quite quickly. I mean, opium is fascinating because it can be grown seasonally in different areas. In Afghanistan itself, I think there are at least 3 growing seasons, right? It doesn't need much water. These are kind of like, these are wartime crops, some of them. I mean, opium is a great wartime crop. You can grow it in a terrain where all the irrigation canals have been destroyed by landmines and bombing and so on, right? You don't need much water. You do need some intensive farm labor, but it's not that difficult to achieve in these societies. And so opium cultivation can literally bounce around the globe depending upon what geographic area is being squeezed. That's the balloon effect. You squeeze one area, the other area expands, right? So the stimulus of prohibition is I think an economic fact that belies, still it's kind of like the it's garlic to the vampire party of the UN drug control people who refuse to acknowledge that it exists, and they continue to boast, as does the DEA, of busts in one area, or the destruction of this meth lab, or of this. But I think the golden formula that McCoy traces historically is this, unless you do this on a global scale, unless you do it completely. And one very authoritarian state, China, has done this for opium. We think they've largely eradicated opium production, but of course production bounced to Southeast Asia, it bounced to Afghanistan, it continues to bounce, it's bounced to Mexico, and then of course you have the broad, unending synthetic frontier. So I think the stimulus of prohibition is really, I think, the most devastating critique that the drug control crowd has never really seriously dealt with. And you see, I mean, the institutional logic. I mean, if you're the DEA, you're not going to acknowledge the domino at the bottom of the pyramid that makes the whole organization collapse, right? That's illogical. And the UNODC is not going to admit that it's built upon a fallacy. So these are all important arguments, I think, that point to really the centrality of what states do, how we're losing, and then really the error of supply side logics. And here I'm really promising you, I'm getting out to the end. And then again, we look, I move from the abstract to the concrete. And that is, what has the drug war done in concrete societies? I think Central America is the most glaring and disturbing example. This is an image from The Economist from years ago. This tells us about poverty, murder rates, years of schooling, and so on. And there, Central America, there are many reasons why Central America is the way it is. And now we have climate change to add to the story. But of course, being a front line of the Cold War was fundamental, of ideological polarization, of proxy war. But in recent years, of course, this is a corridor for transport from South America to Mexico to American markets, to American consumers. It's also a corridor for the movement of weapons. So if you think of the crucial role that American-made guns plays in all this, Central American societies bear the brunt of this. And then lastly, another wrinkle is our American immigration policy, where since 1980s, these communities have come to the United States seeking safety, seeking livelihoods, and our deportation policies have often sent back people who form street gangs in LA, Virginia, and elsewhere. Have sent them back so that now we have a kind of what were once street gangs have become international drug terror organizations, in effect, that currently terrorize these societies in kind of unending cycle. So these are all, again, I'm mixing together a host of features, migration, Cold War politics, drought, population migration, but geography is fundamental. These are corridors across which these commodities move, and with them come corruption, come violence, come a host of social ills, and homicide is just the most dramatic one here. And so that's another way just to imagine. I think I've been very convinced in thinking about, I call my course the global drug wars, but what's a war? I'm getting out of my lane here, moving into political science, but what's a civil war? What's a drug war? I would just share these quotes for you here to think about we think about numbers. I mean, the Colombian conflict is many wars at once, arguably, right? It telescopes many different kinds of conflicts. But much of that, in the end, of course, is about coca and control of the drug trade, and ultimately getting this to American noses, right? And then Mexico. Mexico. I know some of you have been following this, but given California's proximity, but I think most Americans are really not aware of the scale of violence in recent years, particularly since 2006, when the drug war really escalated and the war metaphor became more predominant, and the actual kind of tools of the drug war became much more militarized, and policies became much more militarized. And much of that was, I think one critique I would make of the Toronto article you read was that, I'm not so clear that Mexico and Colombia were asking for help as much as they were, a subordinate partner to the U.S., really forced to accept what Washington wanted to happen. And the numbers have been just staggering. And NAFTA played a role in 1992 in dumping cheap agricultural products, impoverishing many Mexicans, forcing them into the drug trade and drug production. But if you look at this is 2016, but you look at where were people dying across the planet? You think of the big wars, you think of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Then we had Mexico, 20,000. And to my horror, I discovered just last week that there's a new UN report that counted. I've been following this for years, and it's funny how numbers add up. But it used to be there were 20,000 disappeared in a year, and you thought, oh, that's really horrible. But now there's a registry in Mexico that counts about 100,000 disappeared people, and 98% of them are from 2006, which is the moment of the intensification of the U.S.-Mexico drug war and its militarization. And just as a side note, this article says in the small print below that only 36 cases have been prosecuted in Mexico of these forced disappearances since 2006. And these are mostly men you think of in the kind of working age, who would be assassins, who would be kind of foot soldiers in the drug war from 18 to 40 or so. Mostly in that age group, but also younger, also a lot of women now. And it's really taken a huge toll on Mexican society. But 100,000, since 2006 is really staggering. And these are people who, they won't be returned. I mean, these might as well be deaths, but they retain the category of forced disappearance for various reasons. And in short, there's total impunity in Mexico, and that's what the drug war has produced. So these are all arguments that I offer to suggest that the supply side policies, fight them there, are morally, really bankrupt. I keep telling you I'm going to quit, but I can't quit. So let me do my last question. It's number 6, rehabilitation. I guess I'll give you 1 point for either answer. But let me just conclude by raising some questions about this that I've learned in teaching this course. I would have said, yeah, of course, rehabilitation, of course, a non-punitive, more humane approach to policies is what we need across the board. And yet when you dig into this, and I've only done this officially, but you quickly learn, and you've probably seen reports on this during the pandemic, that the so-called, what I call the rehabilitation, whatever, it's an industry, right? It's worth at least 42 billion, and that was 2 years ago. So I'm not sure how your stock portfolios are looking these days. Probably not so well, not so good like mine. But this is massive, and in Florida and Southern California, all kinds of people have moved into this with no scientific or medical expertise, and this is a tragic story of people being sold a promise, a solution, and they're being conned. And it's really, this is an unregulated sphere of American healthcare life that is really extremely disturbing to see develop and really be the source of so much revenue for people who don't really have the best interest of people in mind. And to get at this, I assign this incredible book by Angela Garcia, who's an anthropologist at Stanford, who has written this incredible ethnography of New Mexico. And she starts out in a drug clinic there, and we meet Latino New Mexican families in rural, depressed towns who use drugs and experience drugs in ways that completely surprised me. And I'll just offer a brief snapshot of some of her findings. But one of them is that she argues that, because of the legacy of Spanish colonial rule and transition to American life, and then just the kind of history of these communities, people tend to use, and the proximity to Mexico, the cheapness, the economic availability of drugs, that families use together. So it's not the portrait of the, misguided young kid who, buys something on the street corner and then goes to his bedroom to hide out and is isolated. These are kind of communal practices. Families use together. Parents often turn their kids onto opium, and it becomes a kind of mode to build family and community in areas that are deeply depressed, and in which families bond together through the suffering and the kind of rhetoric of caring for one another. And so families care for one another as addicts in ways that are really deeply disturbing, but also I think surprisingly humanizing. I mean, you get a feel for why people living extremely difficult lives use, in a context where people are dying all around them, and they continue to use, and partly they go to cemeteries and use, they go to grave sites and use, and so the kind of dynamic and cycle there is quite revealing and of course extraordinarily depressing. The book is a tearjerker, but another major offering that she makes, she offers, I think in a subtle way, a really powerful critique of 12-step programs, and I think that's the dominant mode for addiction management in the United States. Alcoholics Anonymous and so on. And I know those do wonderful things for people, and they've helped tens of millions of people across the planet. But her critique is that for people in this community that she studies, the idea of chronicity, the idea that once an addict, always an addict, that you will never overcome this, actually becomes a kind of self-defeating trap for many of these people that she comes to know. And in fact, this idea of chronicity actually becomes a major motivation for suicide, for continued use, and then for ending their lives by overdose. And so it's quite a fascinating critique of the limits of our imagination, thinking about what we can do about this medically and so on. And then she does a profile of basically what treatment looks like in New Mexico, and she talks about a lot of Clinton era legislation, which gave rise to what that's clinics that are kind of medical, kind of prison, and the people who end up there describe themselves as being, she uses a kind of a patient prisoner metaphor to describe that this isn't really fully an alternative to imprisonment. It really, especially for those who are caught up in it, it still feels like prison. It's not really a full diversion. It's not really a much more humane path. In the end, it feels like another kind of trap. So it's a really, you have to really be in the mood for this book. You have to have a strong kind of center and have something to take a break, because it's really incredibly moving. But I think I've always teared up in reading it, and it's so moving. And these are good people. These are not villains. They're not criminals, but they find themselves in communities that are deeply suffering, and when they seek help, they're confronted with a series of traps. And for most of these people, there's no real escape. And I will conclude here with another round of inquiry. And here I'm even more incompetent to speak on the validity of the arguments, so I encourage you to explore them. There's a neuroscientist at Columbia, Carl Hart, who actually has made a huge intervention publicly, and you'll find him in interviews all the New York Times and elsewhere, who basically said, if we look at neuroscience, and he's a Black man, he says we've been misled. We've been made to think that any drug use is going to make you an addict, and that every drug addict should go to jail. And he says, this is built upon American racism, it's built upon blaming the victims, and it's built upon bad science. So he walks us through the scientific arguments for why drugs, first of all, are not as dangerous as we think, and secondly, how addiction can be treated differently. And so I'll leave it to him to explore those arguments with you. But it's an encouraging set of arguments, but also, it's rooted in science, not a scientist. And then just last year, he wrote a follow-up book called Drug Use for Grownups, in which he he admitted, I mean, I wondered during the first book, but he admits that he is what he calls a recreational heroin user and a Columbia professor and much decorated scholar and public intellectual. And he argues that, it's not for kids, it's not for teenagers, it's not for certain people, but again, he attempts to disarm the punitive and kind of alarmist arguments about drug control and argue that there are alternative ways for harm reduction, for management, for use. And there's a libertarian streak. He has liberty in his subtitle, so that was a surprise given the rest of his biography. But these are arguments, I think, that are now very much in the public domain that aren't policy proposals per se, but I think are more and more the talk of people who are concerned. Looking at the destruction of Mexico, of Colombia, and of our cities and of our prisons. And I'll simply end there because I've gone on too long. I have a list of potential alternatives, but I will leave the floor to you all now, and I'll leave it to you to propose alternatives if you see them necessary. And Tom, I expect you to take the scores and reward the top student with the perfect score.
Yeah, so thank you, Bob, for that informative, if somewhat depressing.
Sorry, that's what I do best, Tom. Sorry.
Presentation. No, that
Yeah.
It is imperative that we understand the magnitude, the history, the complexity of this phenomenon. Invite people to put questions into the chat function. I know I have some. As a transition,
Yes,
I'd like to make an observation that underscores some of the points that you made. That in 2005, when I was put in charge of implementing intelligence reform legislation from 2004, a portion of which reduced, if not completely erased, barriers between foreign intelligence and foreign policy, border controls, and law enforcement inside the United States in order to have an end-to-end. It was motivated by terrorism, but drugs and other forms of smuggling clearly fell into this. And one of the first analytic products that was delivered to me as I was in charge of all analysis in the US government at the time, had been started before, and it was the first product that looked at this sort of borderless approach to drugs. And it had a pretty lengthy study of drug production in South America, transit through Mexico, entering the United States at the southern border. And it reached the conclusion that a primary factor to explain this phenomenon was corruption in the police, the military, and the politicians in Mexico and in the producer countries. And I rejected this study in its entirety. Because I didn't get the answers that I thought were appropriate to two questions. One of them was all of the arrows coming up from the south stopped at the Rio Grande. I said, is it the case that we no longer have drugs in New York or Boston or Washington or Chicago or Seattle? And of course we have drugs there. I said, well, how did they get there? The arrows all stop at the border. That if the explanation for how they move from south to north, the border, is corrupt police, corrupt military, and corrupt politicians, are you telling me that we don't have any corrupt police and politicians, and therefore there are no drugs? Or are you telling me that we do have drugs, but the reasons that they move around in the United States are different than those in the other countries? I did not get a good answer to this, and that report did not ever go forward. But the temptation to displace responsibility from us to them, whoever the us is, whether it's a white population displacing it on non-white population in the United States, or the United States displacing it on other countries. That
Right.
it leads to feel good, it leads to expensive, and it certainly leads to ineffective, and maybe counterproductive outcomes, because we've defined the problem incorrectly,
Right.
or we've chosen approaches that satisfy other requirements than curtailing drugs. The other transitional observation is, I'll summarize as underappreciating the economic rationality of, call them peasants, of poor people. And the underscore how this works and the complexity, and you know more about Afghanistan here than I do, but in order to alleviate poverty in Afghanistan in the 1950s and 1960s, the United States had massive aid programs to build irrigation facilities to make it possible to grow more crops, to generate wealth. It probably shouldn't be a surprise that the portions of Afghanistan that produce the most opium are those which have access to USAID built irrigation projects. Not because the US wanted to promote drug cultivation, but because the peasants acted with economic rationality. They could grow beans and peas and have a limited market and earn a limited amount of money, where they could drug drugs and make enough money to make it through the entire year. That the failure to understand all dimensions of this problem is what I'm getting at. And as I see questions are coming, if you wish to comment on what I just said, then I'll begin others' questions.
Sure, no, that's amazing, Tom. Thank you. That's there's so much there. If I could briefly just reiterate and applaud your first observation. I think many heads of state of Latin American and other countries would firmly agree with you and applaud your attention to that. I think the finger pointing, I think, is a source of great frustration. And I think the question that really isn't adequately addressed in policy literature, but also I think on the more academic side, is really fundamentally why do Americans use so much? Why do we consume so many drugs? And of course, we're a big country, right? But what is it about American life that makes us so prone to this? And I think one of the audience members asked about fentanyl, and there's a lot we can say about that. But I think that question belongs to that broader question. I mean, what is it that that's a convoluted kind of, I think, trajectory of developments. But basically, I think most high schools should be, and I hope are, telling students today that any pill that you'll encounter is of unknown contents, right? We don't know what you're getting. Things have been laced. Some dealers actually intentionally create certain amount of product that they hope will cause overdose, because that makes the product more attractive for some portion of their market, right? So in today's world, I mean, overdose is built into the marketing, unfortunately. And I think that the stigma around drugs, I mean, the absence of, it's reminiscent of, the HIV AIDS scare. I mean, the kind of the anxiety around, education about sexual health and so on, and distributing products that could make people suffer. I mean, at the, clean syringes, and now fentanyl test kits. And now, for example, at Stanford, there's debate around, Narcan, drugs that can reverse overdoses. And I think, the Stanford's a very conservative institution that doesn't want to create the impression that people are using these drugs, but of course they are. And unfortunately, they are tragically dying as well. So I think there's much more we can do to recognize that fentanyl is part of the air we breathe now, unfortunately, in our communities. And and it really doesn't distinguish by race or class or geography. And I think going back to Tom's point about the finger pointing, I think that we need just much more honesty and a much more self-critical approach, one that, admirably, in your view, Tom, links the international and domestic within the same kind of conversation. And then, of course, the heads of state of these countries have been saying at the UN now for some years that, the United States needs to deal with its demand problem. This is not just a supply side problem. This is a demand problem. And adjacent to that is the problem of guns, right? I mean, there would be no war per se. I mean, we can use that, we often talk in my class about the rhetoric and what that means. That means that, the term war gives license to certain kinds of violence, and certain kinds of authority, and certain kinds of consequences, and then excuses, right? Shifting blame, pointing fingers. If it's war, certain kinds of deaths are inevitable and accepted. But it's the US that generates the weapons that fuel this. And you may have seen last week that the Mexican government filed a lawsuit asking for $10 billion, a judgment against US arms manufacturers, who actually, it's shown, do manufacture some guns. They make all kinds of guns, but some actually are tailor-made to appeal to a certain kind of drug cartel aesthetic, using certain kind of folk figures, narco saints and so on in their imagery, to the tune of 100 million weapons a year. And the BBC story about this last week highlighted the fact that there is essentially one legal gun shop in Mexico, and all these arms flow north to south, right? So we militarize our border for humans coming north, but it's open season for drugs moving the other way. For Mexican citizens crossing to buy buy guns to bring them back, but also for all kinds of American entrepreneurs to make that their life's work, to bring drugs to Mexico to fuel this violence. So I think that
guns to Mexico.
I'm sorry, to Mexico. Yeah, sorry. Yes. And so I mean, it's actually that's one thing I can report from the classroom. That's one thing that young people are thinking about is what is our collective culpability? To what extent is American society broadly complicit in the demand that we create that leads to these circumstances? But let me pause there, and I think
the first question I think is granted that the war on drugs has failed to significantly diminish drug use in the United States, but the question is, what effects has that effort had, positive and or negative?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very difficult kind of measure or ledger to draw, but I think it's been almost wholly negative. I think starting with American domestic consequences, on African American families, that have been destroyed, and now increasingly on all kinds of families. I think Carl Hart, the African American scholar whose books I cited at the end, and he's very, very careful toward the end of his book to say that many of the prejudices and stereotypes that we mapped onto drugs and marginal people, began with Chinese, Mexican, African American, but they moved to poor white people, and the way we talk about methamphetamine, and now dealing with the opioid crisis. And it's quite fascinating to think about different in and out groups and how they're affected. And I think just to look at the 100,000 deaths last year, I think you can't say that that's a victory. I think that there are many causes there, but I think the inability of the state to actually do what it claims to do in terms of regulation. And then broadly, I think I have a chart there of the alternatives. I think that we think of how we fought the drug war. It's been about basically locking people up and giving them harsher and harsher sentences over the years, and then excluding them from other parts of society. But what we've not addressed, are things like mental health, physical health. Our whole public healthcare system could go a long way to addressing the needs of people. And this is one of Carl Hart's kind of moving from the laboratory, as a neuroscientist. I mean, his approach to drug addiction is that if people had other needs fulfilled, people would not resort to drugs. If their day-to-day lives were not so difficult and horrific, they would not need to retreat into a realm of escapism, or essentially treating themselves, sedating themselves, or otherwise trying to find out other kinds of medicine to make themselves feel better, right? So it's kind of it would take a broader social intervention addressing poverty, addressing job opportunities, addressing, but first and foremost, I think, public health, with mental health playing a very important role. And if one looks at, the broad health of our prison population, the numbers of people who are, have diabetes and other kinds of, ailments, but then of course the mental health dimension is enormous. And most of those people were and are remain actual drug users, right? So I think that there's something to be said about a more holistic investigation of, why people use, right? And what is it about American life in particular that drives that, which is really incomparable if we look at it on a global scale. And this is where I would amplify Tom's point again, that we need a truly a global lens on the problem, one that doesn't, take the U.S. domestic conditions out of the formula. And then to extend further, Tom, I mean, has this been good or bad? I mean, I think if the whole war framing really ignores the fundamental economics. I mean, the McCoy's economics of, the stimulus of production, but then if you get into like rural Peruvian, Colombian, Mexican communities, Afghan communities, we're asking people not to grow a commodity that would put food on the table, right? Because of its effects in the United States, right? But we often do this, say in Mexico, in a place where, after NAFTA, we also flood that same community with, cheap corn grown in Iowa, right? So there's a global imbalance of power and of wealth, which takes otherwise, these mountain Mexican communities who would be very happy growing tomatoes, corn, chiles, and so on, right? Their stock, commodities, right? But the global marketplace has devalued production in many of these places. So, and during the American presence in Afghanistan, for example, the USAID and other agencies would not, they did not want to fund wheat or cotton programs because they didn't want them competing with the American market. Mm-hmm. So I think I have a rural bias because of where I come from, and having people in my past who are farmers. But I think that really, I mean, the drug war as a global phenomenon, at some fundamental level, comes down to agriculture and price levels, and whether or not we can actually incentivize people to actually follow their preference, which would be to produce non-illicit commodities, right, for a whole host of reasons. Because in many cases, of course, once you get into the illicit commodity game, you become a debtor. You become part of a criminal enterprise, and who wants that? And your land rights and labor are now subject to organizations that employ violence, and it's a deadly spiral. But if you can't grow wheat or cotton or chiles or tomatoes or corn because of these international trade agreements that actually privilege North American or specifically American corn and wheat and stuff, it's losing bargains. So I think that one fundamental foundation of this entire question is about the state of agriculture globally, and what we can do for especially mountain communities who have been squeezed by free trade policies. And then on the pharmaceutical side, I mean, the fentanyl question I want to address, I saw it in the box a moment ago. I mean, that's more challenging. I think it's a cliche, but I think the role of public education is absolutely fundamental, because it's going to be really hard to interdict Mexican and Chinese factory production of these illicit pharmaceuticals that you can buy on the dark web, and Stanford students are buying. Unfortunately, I mean, this is not the ne'er-do-well or whatever. This is ubiquitous. I mean, people are buying, and I would put a challenge to you all. I think tonight, all of you could go online and find half a dozen things that could be surreptitiously delivered to your door within a week from all over planet Earth, and no one would ever know. I mean, that's the state of play in our globalized gray market drug marketplace. And no agency is going to interdict all that. And I think we've got to be, I mean, it's whack-a-mole, right, with the factories and with other states. But I think that this is where public education is so crucial, and not to act like good private school kids don't do this. I mean, they do this. In fact, they often do it more, right? And this isn't just a problem of race or class. Tragically, this is a universal phenomenon, and I know many families here have been affected by overdoses and other deaths and tragedies. And it's really and then unfortunately our public debate, at least in political circles, is still very much about punishment, and that's the great frustration. I think that people like Carl Hart are offering different answers, and even Angela Garcia's critique of the 12-step world and of clinics of rehabilitation and so on. I mean, I think critique is very productive in making people improve, and I think there are many solutions on hand that have to be considered. And I think some decriminalization, some legalization, some harm reduction are all appropriate. Much more public education, but also I think the problem of agriculture and global. I think income equality, domestically and internationally, with agriculture being a particular emphasis. I mean, it's really, I think the drug question touches on so many different spheres, economic, moral, ethical, cultural, that I think to really achieve a solution that we all desire will take, not tons more money. I mean, the money's there. I mean, but a kind of a shifting, a reprioritization, because and Tom knows this better than I, but the logic of an institution like the DEA, and if you, I would invite you to go to the website. I mean, they speak of for example, a drug-free America. And to think of that, I mean, if that's really their policy in 2022, it's just staggering. I mean, the disconnect between what's happening, say, at Stanford. Again, these are all, I keep using that community because I'm not a student there, I'm a professor there, but I anecdotally, and I have a teenager and so on, but I think that the gap between, the reality of what people are doing today, of all age groups, right? And the rhetoric of the state institution is just, very disconcerting. And that money can go to other things, right? And just the state of our prisons, I think none of us want, in California or anywhere else, to lock up 20 people over really, nonviolent offenses, which in the end, destroys whole families. I mean, the way it's set up. I mean, if you lose public housing and you lose the right to vote, I mean, we're erasing our democracy for whole categories of people because of, them often being in the wrong place at the wrong time, using the wrong drug that, lots of people have gotten away with using because of their race, class, or whatever. So, I mean, the fundamental inequity of the drug war is also something that, I mean, that alone should ask us, push us to reflect on, all its shortcomings. And I would say, I mean, its initial goal was to, for public health and safety. And I think on all those measures, it's failed. If you think of, 100,000 Mexicans dead or missing since 2006, and then perhaps another 200,000 known to be dead. I mean, that's probably 300,000 people in that country alone in 15 years. That's, no one can claim victory at that. And then, 100,000 Americans dead. I mean, how's that a victory? I mean, that's, no one's safer or healthier for that.
We've run out of time, although we have not certainly exhausted the subject. And I don't mean to sound flippant, but the discussion this evening has underscored the extent to which drugs, like many of the other issues that we've discussed during this year's great decisions and earlier ones, boils down to a case in which, in order to fix a particular problem that is as extensive, as costly, as complex as this one is, it's necessary to fix lots and lots of other dimensions of our society, of our economy, of the political system. And the part that sounds very flippant is that we can't fix anything without fixing everything. Right. Figuring out how to tackle that sequentially, simultaneously, building support for it is a huge task. And the Great Decisions series and its public education function aims to enable all of us as individuals to recognize nonsense when we hear it, to think about solutions and ways to get them into the system. That Bob, I thank you for taking time from your vacation trip to Reno for volleyball to share your insights with us. And since this is our final session of the Great Decisions season, I want to thank Lou Bellardo for the technical and the advertising and just the mechanics, the logistics of getting people signed up. Charlotte Kutkowski for her help in posting things to the web and getting announcements out. And to everybody that has contributed with your presence, with your questions, with your comments to me and to others afterward. And thank you again, Bob, for a terrific, if dispiriting and somewhat depressing concluding session.
Yeah, no,
Lou,
thank
do
you.
you have anything else that you want to say to us before we sign off?
I absolutely do. You forgot one person to thank, and that's yourself. Tom, we really appreciate all that you've done to enlist the support of such highly qualified subject matter experts week after week after week. And certainly this series and the series in the past years would not have been the same without your work in that area. So a sincere thank you to you for all you've done to make this work. And I know on behalf of all of the participants, we really appreciate that. And thank you very much for that. So
happy to contribute. And thanks again to everybody.
All right. So
see you next year.
That's right. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording, everybody, and then we'll end the session. And the recording will be available later in the week, and then that will round out all of the recordings for this year. Thank you to everybody. Good night, and have a great upcoming week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.